needle was already in his arm when Corwin Hale heard they might lose her anyway. The room smelled of antiseptic and overheated plastic. Through the glass, a woman in an expensive suit paced the corridor, phone in hand, ignoring everyone around her. His blood darkened the tube faster than the safety limits allowed. But what came next destroyed everything he thought he understood about the morning. The woman whose daughter needed his blood to survive. She was the same person who had dismissed him 3 hours earlier at a Martinez loading dock, telling him his truck didn't belong without ever looking at his face. The hospital database didn't just match blood types, it matched sealed San Mateo County adoption records from August 1994. The child stabilizing upstairs wasn't a stranger. She was his biological half-sister, given up by the mother who had never told him she existed. Drop a comment where you're watching from, and subscribe before someone who never saw you becomes the person who needs you most. Because Corwin is about to discover how many secrets a mother can bury and how much blood it takes to unearth them. The needle was already in his arm when the surgeon said they might lose her anyway, and the words landed without drama, the way facts do when there's no time left to soften them. The room smelled of antiseptic and overheated plastic, the kind of smell that clings to you after you leave. And through the glass partition, a corridor in the pediatric wing of Stanford Children's Hospital stayed unnaturally quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Corwin Hale watched the clear tube darken as his blood moved steadily away from him and tried not to think about how fast it was going, tried not to count the seconds between each pulse of red that disappeared into the collection bag hanging beside the narrow bed. They had called for O negative twice in 10 minutes, not a request but a warning broadcast through the hospital's donor alert system, the kind of announcement that turns waiting rooms silent. He had been sitting 3 floors down with Brielle, watching her color in the margins of her asthma action plan, while they waited for the pharmacy to process her new inhaler prescription, when the first call crackled through the overhead speakers, asking for immediate pediatric donors. The second call came louder, more urgent, and he was already standing before the coordinator at the blood services desk, finished explaining what emergency meant in a place like this. He told her his name and his blood type, watched her eyes widen slightly when he said O negative universal donor, and when she asked if he could give more than the standard unit, he said yes before she could finish the question. The girl upstairs had been airlifted in from Napa County after a crash on Silverado Trail, the details arriving in pieces carried by nurses who spoke carefully, the way people do when they don't know who's listening and don't want to say too much. 7 years old, they said, internal bleeding that wouldn't stop, a rare complication with the abdominal trauma. Her mother had not arrived yet. Corwin nodded as if any of that information changed what he had already decided, as if knowing her age or her injuries made the blood in his veins any more or less necessary. He stared at the ceiling tiles and counted the hairline fractures spreading from the fluorescent fixture, while the machine hummed its steady rhythm. Somewhere beyond the eastern wall, a helicopter lifted off, the sound fading as it banked west toward the coast. It was not until the second bag was halfway full that he understood how much they were taking. The coordinator leaned close and told him the transfusion was stabilizing the child, but the bleeding had restarted once, maybe twice, and they needed margins, needed reserves in case the surgical repair failed. Corwin asked how much more blood they needed, and she hesitated in a way that made the answer obvious before she spoke. As much as you can safely give, she said, and he heard the spaces between those words, heard all the things safety meant when a child was dying 3 floors above him. He had heard that phrasing before. Years ago, in a different hospital down in San Bernardino County, back when Brielle was barely 2, and safety had been a moving target that changed every time the doctors learned something new. He adjusted his breathing the way he had been taught then, slow and measured, and watched the line continue its work. The woman arrived without announcement, and even here, in a hospital corridor north of Palo Alto, where everyone supposedly mattered equally, people made space for her without being asked. She moved through the hallway beyond the glass with the kind of authority that does not need to raise its voice or quicken its pace, and when she spoke to the surgeon, her words carried a weight that made nurses stop and listen even when they were too far away to hear. Corwin noticed the watch first, thin and expensive, and unfamiliar in the way that only custom pieces are. Then the way her hands trembled when she clasped them together as if trying to hold something inside that wanted desperately to escape. He looked away before she could look back, focusing instead on the warning label taped to the IV pole, the small print about donation limits and adverse reactions, and knowing when to stop. Subscribe before you realize how much someone's emergency will cost you. Outside the room, the woman's phone buzzed and buzzed again in her coat pocket, but she never reached for it. Never broke her conversation with the surgeon, who kept glancing toward the donation room, as if checking whether the blood was still flowing. The machine hummed, the tube darkened, and Corwin Hale lay there watching a stranger's panic through reinforced glass, not yet understanding that her crisis and his morning were about to collide in ways that would make the blood he was giving feel like the smallest thing he would lose today. The first warning came in the form of a question that was not really a question at all, delivered by a nurse whose name tag read Filipovic, and whose eyes kept drifting to the numbers on the monitor beside Corwin's bed. She asked if he understood the risks of giving more than the standard donation amount, if anyone had explained what happened when the body lost too much volume too quickly, and when he nodded she asked again, slower this time, as if repetition might change his answer. He told her he understood, which was not the same as saying he had been told, and she made a note on the tablet she carried without breaking eye contact. The machine continued its work, indifferent to the conversation happening around it. The liability release appeared on the tablet screen a moment later, the kind of document designed to protect the hospital more than the person signing it, and Corwin scanned the paragraphs without really reading them, because he had learned long ago that the fine print only mattered if you survived to argue about it. He signed with his finger, the digital signature coming out shaky and uneven, and handed the tablet back. Nurse Filipovic asked if he wanted water, and he said yes, then watched her leave and return with a plastic cup that felt too light in his hand, as if even the water were trying to conserve weight. He drank it in 3 swallows and felt nothing change. The coordinator returned sometime later, though time had started to feel negotiable, the minutes stretching and compressing depending on whether he was watching the bag fill or watching the corridor beyond the glass, where the woman with the expensive watch paced in careful circles. The coordinator checked his blood pressure twice in what felt like 30 seconds, her frown deepening with each reading, and when she told him the numbers he understood why. 120/70 had dropped to 98/62, a slide that would have alarmed him if he had the energy left to feel alarmed. She asked if he felt dizzy, and he said no, though the edges of the room had begun to soften in a way that suggested the room might disagree. They needed 1 more bag, she told him, maybe 2 if the child's condition deteriorated again, and the way she phrased it made it clear that deterioration was not a possibility but an expectation. Corwin asked how long each bag would take, and she said 20 minutes under normal circumstances, longer if they had to slow the draw because his pressure kept dropping. He did the math in his head and came up with an answer that felt both too long and not long enough. Somewhere in the building, his daughter Brielle was still waiting in the pharmacy area on the 3rd floor, probably awake by now, probably wondering where he had gone and why he had not come back. He had left her with his jacket and his phone and instructions to stay in the chair by the window. The same instructions he gave her every time circumstances separated them in ways he could not predict or control. The second bag filled slower than the first, and with the slowness came a creeping awareness of sensations he had been pushing to the periphery. The coldness that started in his fingers and worked its way up his arms. The way his legs felt distant and unconvincing when he shifted them beneath the thin blanket someone had draped over him without asking. The metallic taste that gathered at the back of his throat despite the water he kept drinking. He focused on the ceiling tiles again, counting them in groups of 4, then losing count and starting over, a rhythm that gave his mind something to do besides catalog the ways his body was beginning to protest. Through the glass, the woman had stopped pacing and now stood perfectly still with her back to the wall, her phone finally in her hand but her eyes not on the screen. She was watching something down the corridor. Her posture rigid in a way that suggested she was either holding herself together or holding something back, and when a doctor in surgical scrubs approached her she straightened even further, as if preparing for impact. Corwin could not hear what they were saying, but he could read the rhythm of it, the way the doctor's hands moved in small precise gestures and the way the woman's shoulders dropped fractionally with each sentence. Good news delivered carefully still carried the shape of caution. The 3rd bag began before he had fully agreed to it, the coordinator making the decision for him based on numbers and protocols he was no longer in a position to question. She told him this was the limit, that after this they would need to stop whether the child was stable or not, and he appreciated the honesty, even as he understood it was probably hospital policy to frame necessity as choice. His blood pressure had dropped again, down to 90/58, a number that made the machine beep twice before settling into its rhythm. Nurse Filipovic returned and adjusted something on the IV line, her movements efficient but not rushed, and when she asked if he could feel his feet, he lied and said yes. The room tilted slightly when he closed his eyes, a slow rotation that reminded him of the time he had given blood in San Bernardino years ago, back when Brielle was a toddler and he had been donating plasma twice a week to cover the gap between paychecks. They had pushed him too far one afternoon in July, taking too much because the clinic was understaffed and the demand was high, and he had passed out in the recovery chair with his daughter sleeping against his chest. He had woken to find a different nurse hovering over him with orange juice and crackers, her voice sharp with something between concern and anger, asking him why he had not told them he was already anemic. He had not known the answer then, and he did not know it now, except that sometimes need was louder than biology. Subscribe before you ignore every warning your body gives you. The woman in the hallway finally moved, turning toward the donation room, as if she had only just noticed it was there. And for a moment Corwin thought she might come inside, might cross the threshold and force the interaction he had been postponing through sheer stillness. But she stopped at the glass, her hand rising to touch the surface before falling back to her side. And then she turned away again, her shoulders carrying a weight that even expensive tailoring could not hide. The machine hummed, the bag filled, and Corwin Hale lay there giving pieces of himself to a stranger's child, while his own daughter waited 3 floors below, not yet understanding that some mornings stretch longer than they should, and some costs get calculated later. Her name arrived before she did, carried down the corridor by a nurse, who spoke it to the surgeon with a kind of deference that made other conversations pause mid-sentence. Lenora Voss. The syllables landed with weight in the pediatric wing's artificially calm atmosphere, and even from behind the glass partition of the donation room, Corwin could see the shift in posture among the staff, the way people straightened and checked their name badges as if suddenly aware they might be seen. She appeared moments later, moving through the hallway with the kind of certainty that comes from never having to wonder whether doors will open or whether people will move aside, and they did both without her asking, creating a path that seemed to form in front of her like something inevitable. She wore dark gray, expensive in a way that did not announce itself but that became obvious in the way the fabric held its shape as she moved, and her hair was pulled back severely enough to show the architecture of her face, all sharp angles and controlled expression. The watch caught the fluorescent light as she gestured while speaking to the surgeon. Thin and gold and probably worth more than Corwin's truck, the kind of timepiece that kept better track of minutes than most people kept of years. Her phone was in her other hand, but she was not looking at it. Her attention fixed completely on the surgeon's face as he spoke, and when she responded, her voice carried down the corridor with a precision that suggested she was accustomed to being heard the first time. For a moment, watching through the glass as the surgeon delivered what appeared to be positive news based on the woman's posture softening fractionally, Corwin allowed himself to feel something close to satisfaction. He had done what most people only talked about doing. Given blood when it mattered. Saved a child's life through pure biological compatibility and willingness to endure discomfort. The machine beside him had stopped humming, its work complete, and he felt the specific relief that comes from knowing you helped without needing recognition or reward. In another 20 minutes he would collect Brielle, and they would leave, and this would become a story he might tell someday about the afternoon he donated blood during an emergency at Stanford. Simple, clean, resolved. Then he noticed her hands. They were trembling despite how still she held the rest of herself, fingers clasping and unclasping around the phone in a rhythm she probably did not know she was performing. Her shoulders, rigid beneath the perfect tailoring, carried tension that no amount of wealth or authority could fully disguise. And her eyes, when they finally stopped moving long enough for him to see them clearly, held something that looked less like fear and more like the thing that comes after fear, when you have already calculated the worst outcome and are now simply waiting to see if calculation matches reality. The surgeon was explaining something with small, careful gestures, his hands tracing invisible diagrams in the air between them, and Lenora Voss nodded at intervals that suggested she was following medical terminology most people would struggle to parse. She asked questions that Corwin could not hear, but could read in the surgeon's responses, each answer seeming to satisfy her briefly, before she asked another, drilling down through layers of information with the methodical precision of someone who had spent a lifetime getting exactly what she needed from conversations. A nurse approached with a tablet, and Lenora signed something without reading it, her signature quick and practiced, then turned back to the surgeon, as if the interruption had never happened. The voice pattern caught him first when she spoke again. Not the words she was saying, but the specific cadence of her speech, the way she clipped certain consonants and let others slide. How do you measure the weight of recognition when it arrives too late to matter? He tried to place it through the exhaustion, searching for the connection his mind was attempting to make, but the pieces would not quite fit together. The machine beside him beeped twice as his blood pressure dropped another few points, and Nurse Filipovic appeared to check the reading, her presence briefly blocking his view of the hallway. And when she moved aside again, Lenora had shifted position, now standing near the windows that looked out over the Stanford campus, stretching away toward the hills. Behind her, a medical resident approached with paperwork, and she handled it without turning fully, signing with her left hand while keeping her eyes on the window, and the resident retreated with the kind of efficiency that suggested he knew better than to linger. Another nurse passed and nodded respectfully in Lenora's direction, receiving a fractional acknowledgement in return, the kind of micro-interaction that reinforced hierarchy without requiring words. The surgeon had stepped away to consult with someone else, leaving her momentarily alone in the corridor, and for the first time since arriving she allowed her posture to soften slightly, her shoulders dropping perhaps an inch as she pressed one hand against the window glass. She turned from the window as the surgeon returned, her mask of composure sliding back into place with visible effort, and as she moved, Corwin caught her profile clearly for the first time. The shape of her jaw, the specific angle of her cheekbones, the way she held her chin slightly raised when listening, as if measuring every word against some internal standard of acceptability. And suddenly the voice pattern connected to a memory from earlier that same morning, before the sun had burned off the fog that clung to the Carquinez Strait, when he had been unloading pallets at a Martinez distribution center, and someone had told him his truck was blocking access to the private lot reserved for vendors with appointments. The satisfaction evaporated. The simple story became complicated, and Corwin understood that nothing about this afternoon was going to be clean or resolved. The memory sharpened despite the fog in his head. The loading dock behind the warehouse complex off Waterfront Road, the woman in the dark gray suit stepping out of a black sedan. The way she had not said please or thank you, had simply stated that his vehicle did not belong where it was and needed to be moved immediately, her tone suggesting she was informing him of a fact rather than making a request. He had moved the truck without responding, the way he always did when people with money mistook his silence for agreement, and she had not looked at him then either. Had turned away before he could finish backing out of the space, her attention already on her phone and whatever came next in her precisely scheduled morning. Now here she stood, 3 hours and 50 miles south, standing in a hospital corridor depending on his blood to save her daughter's life, and she still had not looked at him once. The recognition settled into his chest with the same cold weight as the blood loss, both unavoidable and both changing something fundamental about how his body was functioning. Corwin closed his eyes and saw the loading dock again, clearer now that exhaustion had stripped away whatever filter usually softened memory. 6:43 in the morning according to the timestamp on the delivery manifest. The fog still thick enough that the Benicia Martinez Bridge was invisible across the strait. His truck angled into the vendor staging area because the overnight driver before him had left a pallet jack blocking the designated space, and he had been trying to decide whether to move it himself or wait for someone with authority to clear it when the black sedan pulled up behind him, with its headlights cutting through the gray morning. She had emerged already irritated, as if his presence were a personal inconvenience rather than a simple logistics problem, and her first words had not been a question about whether he worked there or had authorization, but a statement that his vehicle was blocking access to spaces reserved for scheduled vendors. He had started to explain about the pallet jack, then stopped when he saw her face, saw the expression that said explanations were not required because the situation was already understood and categorized and dismissed. She had gestured toward the street with one hand while checking her phone with the other. A multitasking dismissal that suggested moving his truck was so obvious it barely warranted her full attention, and he had done what he always did in those moments. He had swallowed whatever response wanted to come out, put the truck in reverse, and backed onto Waterfront Road while she walked past the space he had just vacated, without acknowledging the movement. The detail that had stuck with him, the thing he had thought about while driving south toward the Central Valley that morning, was that she had not looked at his face once during the entire interaction. Not when she approached, not when she spoke, not when he moved the truck. Her eyes had stayed on her phone or on the building entrance or on some middle distance that did not include him, as if he were part of the infrastructure rather than a person who might have his own reasons for being where he was. It was not the rudeness that had bothered him, not exactly. He had encountered rudeness before, had learned to let it slide off because getting angry at every slight would have left him perpetually furious. What stayed with him was the completeness of the dismissal, the way she had erased him from consideration so thoroughly that even basic eye contact felt unnecessary. And now his blood was keeping her daughter alive. The thought arrived without bitterness, which surprised him, and without satisfaction, which surprised him more. He had expected to feel something sharp when the recognition fully formed, some vindication or resentment or at least the grim irony of the reversal, but what he actually felt was a kind of hollow pressure, the sense of being caught in a situation that had too many layers and no clear emotional response that fit them all. She was standing in the hallway depending on him, yes, but she did not know she was depending on him, did not know his face or his name, or the fact that she had spent 30 seconds that morning treating him like an obstacle to be removed. The power dynamic had not reversed. It had simply become invisible to the person who held it. Subscribe before someone who never saw you becomes the person who needs you most. Through the glass, Lenora was speaking with the surgeon again, her hands moving in controlled gestures that suggested she was asking specific technical questions, demanding clarity in a crisis that probably felt like it was spinning beyond her control. A nurse brought her water in a plastic cup identical to the ones Corwin had been drinking from, and she took it without looking at the nurse, her attention still fixed on the surgeon's explanation. The nurse retreated. The hallway traffic continued around them, and Corwin watched a woman who had made him invisible try to stay visible herself, try to maintain authority and composure, while her world threatened to collapse, and he found he could not hate her for the morning even though he probably should have. The machine beeped as the third bag reached capacity, and the coordinator moved quickly to disconnect the line, her movements practiced and efficient. She told him they were done, that he had given the maximum safe amount, and that he needed to stay horizontal for at least 20 minutes before attempting to sit up. He nodded, his head feeling loose on his neck, and watched her carry the final bag toward the door that led to the surgical wing. The last of what he could give, disappearing up the corridor in someone's gloved hands, headed toward a child he had never seen and a mother who had never seen him. Nurse Filipovic returned with orange juice and a package of crackers, placing them on the rolling table beside the bed with instructions to consume both slowly. His blood pressure was hovering at 86/54, low enough that standing would be inadvisable for a while, high enough that they were not yet worried about his heart. She adjusted the bed slightly, raising his feet above his heart, and told him that someone would check on him every 10 minutes. The room settled into a kind of suspended stillness, the machine silent now that its work was done, the corridor beyond the glass continuing its choreography of crisis management and careful hope. In the hallway, Lenora's phone finally rang, and she answered it, stepping away from the surgeon and turning toward the windows, her voice dropping to a volume Corwin could not hear. Her posture changed as she listened, shoulders curving forward slightly, and when she spoke again her free hand came up to cover her eyes, pressing against them as if trying to hold something in or push something back. The call lasted perhaps 90 seconds. When she lowered the phone and turned back toward the surgical wing, her face had changed in a way that was hard to define but impossible to miss, as if some internal calculation had shifted and produced an answer she had not wanted. The surgeon approached her again, and she straightened, rebuilding the composure that had fractured during the phone call, but the reconstruction was not quite complete. Something had changed. Some piece of information had arrived and rearranged the landscape. Corwin watched her nod at whatever the surgeon was telling her, watched her ask another question, watched her glance finally toward the donation room, her eyes moving across the glass partition as if noticing it for the first time. She did not see him, or she saw him but did not recognize him, or she saw him and recognized that someone had given blood but did not connect the person in the bed to the person in the Martinez staging area because why would she? People like her did not memorize the faces of people like him. They moved through their days encountering hundreds of service workers and contractors and delivery drivers, and those encounters left no impression because they were designed not to. Because the entire system worked better when certain people remained functionally invisible. Her gaze moved past the donation room and down the corridor, searching for something else, and Corwin felt the weight of that invisibility settle over him again like something familiar he had almost forgotten he was carrying. The paperwork arrived 40 minutes after the final bag left the room, delivered by a woman in business casual clothing whose badge identified her as hospital administration rather than medical staff. She introduced herself as someone from donor services and explained that California state law now required additional documentation for emergency transfusions exceeding standard volume limits. Corwin signed where she indicated, his handwriting still unsteady, the pen feeling heavier than it should. She mentioned something about state genetic disease, tracking databases, and new data-sharing protocols, and his blood pressure monitor beeped twice as if objecting to the bureaucratic language. The administrator left with the paperwork, and Corwin settled back against the raised bed, feeling something that resembled relief beginning to edge out the exhaustion. He had done what he came to do. The child was stable. His body was starting to remember how to function. In another 20 minutes, maybe 30, he could retrieve Brielle from the pharmacy waiting area. Maybe stop for dinner somewhere cheap between here and Sacramento. Let her pick the place as a reward for waiting patiently. The thought of greasy fries and a chocolate shake made his stomach tighten with something between hunger and nausea. The woman who appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later wore a white coat over green scrubs and carried a tablet under one arm. Nakamura, Genetic Counseling Services. She asked if he was Corwin Hale with the careful pronunciation of someone reading a name for the first time, and when he confirmed, she asked if she could speak with him privately. The room temperature seemed to drop. Nurse Filipovic, who had been checking his vitals, excused herself without being asked, and the genetic counselor stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that made the space feel suddenly smaller. The counselor explained that his paperwork had been processed through the California Genetic Disease Tracking System, a database that cross-referenced donor and patient information to flag potential hereditary conditions. Standard protocol, she said, but her expression suggested what came next was anything but standard. His name and birth date had triggered an automatic match against existing records. The tablet's screen glowed between them. Corwin's fingers felt cold, despite the blanket someone had draped over him. The match was against digitized files from San Mateo County, she continued, entered into the state database as part of a records modernization initiative, sealed adoption records. Her voice remained carefully neutral, in a way that suggested she had delivered this kind of information before and had learned to strip emotion from the delivery. The air conditioning unit clicked on overhead, humming louder than seemed necessary. Records originating from Redwood City County offices, processed sometime in the mid-1990s. The system had flagged a maternal lineage connection based on identifying information that appeared in both his donor intake paperwork and the patient's medical history. Maternal lineage. The word sat in his mouth like metal. She asked if he had any knowledge of his biological family history, particularly on his maternal side. The question landed in a place he had stopped examining years ago. He told her his mother had died when he was 19, that she had never discussed her family beyond saying they were not in the picture, that there had been a file somewhere he had never been allowed to see. The counselor made a note on her tablet, the stylus scratching against the screen. She asked if he knew his mother's maiden name before marriage. Breslin, he said. Patricia Ann Breslin. She asked him to spell it, and he watched her expression shift fractionally as she confirmed the spelling matched what appeared in the system. But here's what the database doesn't explain: why this match matters now, why it surfaced during a random blood donation, why systems designed to catch disease patterns had instead caught a secret his mother had carried to her grave. The genetic counselor explained that the patient receiving his transfusion had family medical history on file that referenced the same maternal surname. The genetic tracking system had identified this commonality and flagged it for potential hereditary blood disorders that might affect compatibility. The transfusion itself had been successful and standard, she emphasized, exactly as expected for matching blood types regardless of genetic relationship. But protocol required that he be informed of the lineage flag before the donation file could be officially closed. She asked if he wanted more information about the specific records that had been matched. The fluorescent light above flickered once, then steadied. Corwin stared at the genetic counselor's tablet, at the screen he could not read from where he lay, and felt the room tilt in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss. Maternal lineage. Same surname, sealed records from Redwood City. A patient receiving his blood who shared something in his family history that had been hidden for decades. His blood pressure monitor beeped, and the counselor glanced at it, then back at him. He asked who the patient was, then realized before she could answer that he already knew who the patient was, had known since the first moment Lenora's name had echoed down the corridor. The counselor confirmed what he had not quite asked, explaining that patient confidentiality prevented details, but that genetic relationship flags in the database were only generated when the connection met specific threshold criteria established by state health services. Her voice seemed to come from very far away. She asked again if he wanted to review the matched records, and he opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. In the hallway beyond the closed door, he could hear wheels rolling and voices speaking in professional tones about medical things, all of it feeling like it was happening in a different building entirely. He was about to tell the counselor no, that he did not want more information, that he just wanted to collect his daughter and leave this place and return to the simple narrative where blood donation was straightforward and strangers remained strangers. He was forming the words when his blood pressure monitor beeped twice, and Nurse Filipovic opened the door without knocking. her expression urgent enough to override whatever privacy the genetic counselor had been trying to maintain. The urgent news was good news, which somehow made what came after it worse. The child was stable. Bleeding stopped completely. Surgical team confident enough to transfer from critical to guarded status. Nurse Filipovic delivered the update rapid fire, already moving to check Corwin's vitals one more time, and in that brief compressed window of relief he felt something unclench in his chest. He had done what he came to do. The child would live. Whatever bureaucratic mystery the database had flagged could be dealt with later, or not at all, because it did not change the outcome that mattered. Then the genetic counselor turned her tablet toward him, and the relief detonated. The scanned document filled the screen. Official. Faded. San Mateo County Department of Social Services seal. Date: August 1994. Handwriting in the margins careful and precise, the kind used by people who understand that what they write becomes permanent record. Corwin's eyes caught on his mother's maiden name before processing anything else. Breslin, Patricia Ann. Listed as biological mother in a closed adoption proceeding, parental rights terminated by court order, infant female placed through Catholic Charities into permanent custody of adoptive family. The infant's name had been redacted with a thick, black line, but the date of birth was visible. March 7, 1994. March 7th. The genetic counselor was speaking, but her words arrived distorted, filtered through the sound of his own pulse in his ears. The patient currently in surgery upstairs had been born on March 7, 1994. Her medical intake forms listed a closed adoption from San Mateo County. The database cross-reference had matched maternal lineage markers between his donor paperwork and the sealed records now displayed on the screen. She said the words biological half-sister as if they were a medical term rather than a detonation. His mother had been 17 when he was born, barely 18 when the document on the screen was dated, living in Daly City with her own mother who had thrown her out within 6 months. He had known there were years after his birth, when she had disappeared into systems and shelters and situations she would never talk about. He had not known there was another child. She had never mentioned pregnancy, never mentioned adoption, never left any indication in the boxes of her things he had sorted after she died that there was someone else who shared her blood. The door opened, and Lenora Voss stepped into the room without knocking. Her composure was fracturing at the edges, pieces of the authority she had worn in the hallway coming loose, in a way that suggested she had just received information that required immediate verification. The surgeon was behind her trying to explain something about genetic counseling protocols, but she was not listening. Her attention fixed completely on the genetic counselor's tablet and then on Corwin's face. The counselor started to say something about patient privacy, but Lenora cut her off. What was his mother's name? Not asked gently, not asked with any careful neutrality, asked with the sharp urgency of someone who needed to know if the ground beneath them was actually collapsing or if they were just imagining it. Patricia Ann Breslin, born in Daly City, raised in various places across the Bay Area, died in Sacramento when he was 19. He watched Lenora's face confirm what the genetic counselor's tablet had already made clear. Watched her go very still in the way people do when they have just run every internal calculation and arrived at an answer that destroys every previous assumption. The surgeon was saying something about how rare these database flags were, how the system was designed to catch hereditary conditions, how the transfusion had been standard regardless of genetic relationship. Background noise. The silence growing between Corwin and Lenora was louder than words. She had not known. The adoption had been closed, sealed, designed specifically to prevent this kind of intersection. She had raised a daughter without knowing there was a biological brother somewhere in the California system, moving through the same geography without ever crossing paths, until a helicopter and an emergency and a blood type made crossing paths inevitable. Are you certain? Lenora asked the genetic counselor, her voice stripped of its earlier authority. Any possibility of database error. The counselor explained that maternal lineage markers were definitive. Adoption records and Corwin's intake paperwork verified through multiple identifying factors including birth certificates and Social Security cross-reference. No error, no coincidence that could be explained away. Just the blunt fact of biology asserting itself through bureaucratic systems that were supposed to keep these truths contained. The room contracted, all four of them standing in a space designed for one patient and one visitor, air thick with information that no one had prepared for and no protocol could adequately address. Corwin's blood pressure monitor beeped twice, but the sound barely registered. Lenora was staring at him now, really looking at his face for the first time, trying to find resemblance, trying to map features that might confirm what the documents had already proven. The surgeon cleared his throat. Something about giving them privacy, something about checking on the patient upstairs. He left with the genetic counselor following, both retreating from a situation that had moved beyond medical management into territory that required different expertise. The door closed. The monitor continued its steady beeping. Corwin and Lenora stood in the small room looking at each other. Two people who had shared a morning that now meant something entirely different than either had understood. Connected by blood that had just finished traveling from his body to hers through the small broken body of a child, neither of them had known belonged to both of them. The forms arrived in a folder thick enough to suggest that biology created more paperwork than blood loss, delivered by a social worker whose badge identified her as Patterson from Family Services and whose expression suggested she had already been briefed on the situation's unusual complexity. She spread the documents across the rolling table beside Corwin's bed, the pages making a soft rustling sound that filled the room, and began explaining what each signature would authorize. Consent for genetic testing disclosure, authorization for medical records release, acknowledgement of biological relationship discovery. The pen she provided felt cheap and light, the kind that ran out of ink halfway through forms. He was halfway through signing the third document when he heard Brielle's voice in the corridor asking someone where her father was, and the ordinary sound of her confusion cut through everything else happening in the room. She appeared in the doorway, still carrying her backpack, the strawberry chapstick smell reaching him before she did, and when she saw him lying in the hospital bed with an IV line still taped to his arm, her face showed the particular expression of a child who had been told to wait and had waited longer than promised. "Dad, why do you look like a ghost?" She came to stand beside the bed, close enough that he could see the chocolate stain on her shirt collar from the vending machine candy bar. She had obviously talked someone into buying her. He told her he had given blood to help someone, which was true enough that the rest could wait, and she studied his face with the serious attention she used when checking if he was telling her everything. "Your hand's shaking," she said, watching him try to sign the next form. Then, with the casual expertise of a child accustomed to medical settings, "Did they take too much? You're supposed to tell them when you feel dizzy." For a moment, the weight in the room lifted. Here was his daughter, lecturing him about proper blood donation protocol she had learned from her own endless hospital visits, and despite everything collapsing around him, he felt something close to warmth. Social worker Patterson paused her explanation and looked at Brielle with the trained assessment of someone whose job required noticing children in distress, then looked back at Corwin with a question forming that she had not yet decided to ask. Lenora was still standing near the window where she had retreated after the genetic counselor left, her reflection visible in the glass, and Corwin felt the weight of her attention even without looking directly at her. She was cataloging details about his daughter, the same way he had earlier cataloged details about her. Brielle set her backpack on the floor with a thud and asked if they were leaving soon, if they still needed to go back to the pharmacy to pick up her medication. The vinyl chair creaked as she leaned against it. Patterson's expression shifted as she processed the mention of pharmacy and medication. She asked Brielle what medication she was picking up, her tone careful, and Brielle answered with the practiced ease of a child who had explained her condition enough times to make it routine. "Juvenile diabetes, monthly insulin prescription. My doctor's at Stanford because the endocrinology department here is better than the ones closer to Sacramento but also more expensive, which is why we have to wait for the pharmacy's discount program to process before we can get the refill." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she might explain how to tie shoes, unaware that each word was adding weight to calculations happening in adult minds around her. The information settled into the room with quiet heaviness, and Corwin watched Lenora's posture shift near the window, watched her finally turn to look directly at Brielle, in a way she had not looked at him in the Martinez parking lot. He could see her doing the math that he had already done 1,000 times. Cost of insulin multiplied by months, multiplied by years, weighed against income from contract delivery work. The pharmacy discount program Brielle had mentioned so casually was the only reason they could afford Stanford specialists at all. He had been 2 weeks late on his truck payment last month to cover the copays. The paper on the form was cheap, already curling at the edges where his palms had dampened it. Patterson continued explaining the forms, but her tone had changed slightly, carrying weight that suggested Brielle's medication had added layers to whatever family services assessment she was conducting. She reached the form about legal guardianship designation and next of kin status, the document that would formalize whether Corwin acknowledged biological relation to the child currently recovering 3 floors above them. She explained that signing would create legal recognition of half-sibling status, which could affect inheritance rights, medical decision-making authority in emergencies, and potentially custody considerations. The heating vent above clicked on, warm air pushing against the antiseptic smell. Brielle asked who the other person was, the one who needed blood, and Corwin felt the question lodge somewhere between his ribs. He glanced at Lenora, who had moved closer without him noticing, now standing near enough to the bed that Brielle's attention shifted toward her. The social worker looked between them, pen hovering over her own notes, waiting for someone to answer the child's question. Lenora opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, and in that moment of hesitation Corwin saw something that looked almost like recognition that she had no idea how to navigate this. Patterson asked if Corwin needed more time to review the forms, and he said yes, though time was not actually going to change what the forms required or what signing them would mean. His hands were still shaking, the tremor visible enough that Brielle reached out and steadied his wrist without being asked, her small fingers warm against his cold skin. She leaned against the bed and asked again if they were leaving soon, and he told her soon, yes, even though he no longer had any clear idea of what soon meant or what leaving would look like after everything that had been revealed in this room. Lenora approached the bed when the social worker stepped out to make copies of the unsigned forms, moving with the kind of deliberate purpose that suggested she had been waiting for privacy and had calculated exactly how much time she would have before it disappeared again. The door was still swinging shut when she spoke. She did not apologize for the interruption. She did not thank him for the blood. She asked instead about his mother's medical history, specifically about cardiovascular conditions and autoimmune disorders on the maternal side, and her voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who needed specific information immediately because her daughter's recovery might depend on details that had been buried with a woman who died years ago. Corwin stared at her, trying to process the question through exhaustion and shock, and the surreal awareness that his daughter was standing 3 feet away listening to a stranger ask about the grandmother she had never met. He told Lenora he did not know much, that his mother had kept her medical history as private as everything else about her past, that she had died of complications from pneumonia but that the doctors had mentioned her immune system had been compromised by something they never fully diagnosed. The words felt inadequate, even as he spoke them. Lenora pressed for more, asking if there had been any heart conditions or clotting disorders or histories of abnormal healing, and each question felt like it was excavating something that had been deliberately left alone. A phone buzzed, Lenora's. She glanced at the screen, declined the call without answering, but the interruption had created visible tension in her shoulders. "I have maybe 5 minutes before they need me upstairs," she said. "Please. Anything else you remember?" Brielle asked who the woman was and why she needed to know about Grandma. And Corwin felt the question create a fork in the conversation that he had no idea how to navigate. He could tell his daughter the truth, which would require explaining adoption and half-siblings and biological connections to a 9-year-old who was already confused and tired and waiting to go home. Or he could deflect, which would only delay the inevitable. He chose a middle path that satisfied no one, telling Brielle that the woman's daughter had received his blood and needed to know about family health history. Lenora's attention shifted to Brielle then, really seeing her for the first time as something other than an interruption or a witness. She asked what Brielle's name was, and when Brielle told her she repeated it slowly, as if testing how the syllables felt. Her perfume reached them when she moved closer, expensive, floral, something that smelled like it cost more per ounce than Corwin's hourly rate. Then she asked what grade Brielle was in, whether she liked her school, building a bridge without any clear idea of where it was supposed to land. Brielle answered politely but with increasing confusion, glancing at her father for explanation he could not provide. The conversation returned to medical history because that was the only safe territory available. Lenora asked if his mother had ever mentioned anything about her own mother, about genetic conditions that ran through multiple generations. Corwin thought about the boxes of his mother's belongings, the sparse collection of photos and documents that told a story with more gaps than connections. His maternal grandmother had died young, before he was born, circumstances unclear. His mother had grown up in foster care after that, bouncing between homes in San Mateo and Alameda counties, aging out of the system at 18, with no family connections and no medical records that followed her. The overhead speaker crackled with a page for Dr. Nakamura to the surgical floor. Time was running out. Brielle interrupted to ask if they could please go get her medication now because she was hungry and the pharmacy closed at 7. Her practical concern about insulin and dinner cut through the adult conversation, like a reminder that some urgencies were more immediate than others. Lenora looked at Brielle, then at the backpack on the floor, then at Corwin. Something shifted in her expression recognition that was less about biology and more about the math of raising a child with chronic medical needs while working jobs that barely covered the basics. The fluorescent light above them flickered once. "What kind of insulin does she use?" Lenora asked. When Brielle told her, she nodded slowly. "What's the monthly cost, even with the pharmacy discount?" Corwin told her it was not her concern, which was both true and completely inadequate given everything else they were navigating, but he could not bring himself to accept what the question implied. Lenora did not argue. She simply said that her daughter, the one recovering upstairs, also had medical needs that required careful management. The genetic counselor had mentioned potential hereditary factors that would need monitoring. Understanding the full maternal medical history was not optional if they wanted to prevent complications. She was asking for information, yes, but she was also offering something neither of them had named yet, some possibility of connection or resource sharing that existed in the space between biology and obligation. Brielle asked again who Lenora was, and why it mattered what kind of insulin she used, and this time the question demanded an answer that could not be deflected. Corwin looked at his daughter and saw her trying to piece together a puzzle with shapes that did not make sense. He thought about what she would learn eventually, whether from him or from someone else, about the sister she had not known existed and the family history that had been kept from both of them. The vinyl chair beside the bed squeaked as Brielle shifted her weight. Lenora spoke before he could, her voice softer than it had been in the Martinez parking lot, but still carrying authority. She told Brielle that her daughter was upstairs recovering from an accident, that Brielle's father had helped save her life by donating blood, and that sometimes helping people created connections that were complicated to explain. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough truth that Brielle seemed to accept it, nodding with the seriousness of a child who understood that adults sometimes had reasons for not explaining everything immediately. The social worker returned with copied forms, and the room filled again with the practical business of signatures and acknowledgments, but something had shifted during her absence. Some understanding reached or at least approached between Corwin and Lenora that would require more conversations and more time to fully articulate. Brielle picked up her backpack, the zipper scraping loud in the small room, and asked one more time if they were leaving. Corwin told her yes, soon, as soon as he finished signing what needed to be signed. He looked at the form asking about next of kin status and thought about insulin costs and Stanford specialists and the price of acknowledging that family was more complicated than blood but also exactly as simple as blood, depending on what you chose to do with the information. The form sat on the rolling table between them, unsigned and growing heavier with each passing minute. Social worker Patterson had stopped pretending that her presence in the room was about anything other than waiting for Corwin to make a decision that would legally define what biology had already established. The paper itself was cheap government stock, already curling at the edges where his palms had dampened it. She had explained the implications twice. Medical decisions, inheritance, emergency contacts. But she had not explained the part that actually mattered. Patterson checked her watch. "I need to submit this within the hour," she said, no longer asking. Lenora stood near the window with her back partially turned, but her reflection in the glass showed she was watching everything. Waiting. Whatever happened next would determine not just legal status but something more fundamental. Brielle had finally stopped asking questions and was sitting on the floor organizing the contents of her backpack with methodical focus, but she glanced up periodically, tracking the tension in the room even if she could not fully parse its source. The sound of her removing items and setting them down, pencil case, water bottle, crumpled homework, created a rhythm that filled the silence. The question itself was simple enough to hurt. Did he want to be listed as family? Corwin picked up the pen Patterson had provided, then set it down again. The weight of it felt wrong. He thought about the loading dock in Martinez, standing in fog beside his truck while Lenora gestured for him to move without meeting his eyes. 30 seconds that had been unremarkable to both of them until this afternoon transformed it into something with permanent weight. "Mr. Hale," Patterson said. Her tone had shifted from patient to administrative. "The child upstairs is awake and asking questions." Now his blood was in that child's body, keeping her alive. And the form on the table was asking him to decide whether biology created obligation or whether obligation required something more than shared DNA. He stared at the signature line. What would signing cost him? Pride, certainly. The pride of refusing to be needed by someone who had not needed to see him. Control. The ability to walk away from this hospital and return to the life he had built without reference to family connections that predated his awareness. A knock at the door. A nurse poked her head in. "Miss Voss, they need you on 6. The patient's asking for you." Lenora turned from the window but did not move toward the door. "5 more minutes," she said. The nurse hesitated, then withdrew. What story would you tell yourself about the morning someone dismissed you, if that same afternoon their survival depended on what you were willing to give? But refusing to sign would cost something too. It would cost Brielle the truth about family that extended beyond the tight unit they had formed together. It would cost the child upstairs access to medical history that might matter someday. Genetic information that could prevent complications or inform treatment. It would cost him the possibility of understanding his own history, the parts his mother had never explained about the daughter she had given up. Patterson's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. "They're calling me," she said. "I need an answer." "Wait," Lenora said. She looked at Corwin directly. "I understand if you want to refuse. I recognize the morning was what it was, and that biology doesn't erase rudeness or create obligation where none existed before." Her voice was stripped of the authority it had carried in the hallway. "Whatever you decide will be your decision, and I won't challenge it legally or personally, but I want you to know her name before you make that choice." Isla. 7 years old. Born in March 1994 in a hospital somewhere in San Mateo County, and placed with Lenora 6 days later through an adoption agency that specialized in closed proceedings. Grew up in Atherton with private schools and music lessons, and every advantage that money could provide. Had a genetic condition that required monitoring. Had been on her way home from a birthday party in Napa when the crash happened, riding in the back seat reading a book about sharks. Wearing a seatbelt that had probably saved her life, even as the impact caused internal damage that required emergency intervention. Corwin listened to these details and felt them accumulate into something that resembled a person rather than an abstraction. He looked at Brielle, who had stopped organizing her backpack and was listening with focused attention. He thought about what he would want her to do someday if she were in a position to acknowledge family she had not chosen. Whether he would want her to refuse on principle or accept based on pragmatism, or find some third option that honored both her autonomy and her connection to people who shared her history. The pen sat beside the form. Corwin picked it up again. Not because he had decided, but because not picking it up felt like its own kind of decision. He read through the form one more time, noting the specific language about biological relationship and legal recognition. The ways official documents tried to contain human complexity within checkboxes and signature lines. The heating vent clicked off. The sudden silence made everything louder. He thought about his mother and what she might have wanted. Whether she had kept the adoption secret to protect him, or to protect herself, or to protect the daughter she had given up. Whether her silence on the subject constituted instruction or simply absence. Patterson's phone buzzed again. "The medical team wants to speak with family about next steps," she said. "They need to know who to contact for those conversations." The timeline was collapsing, decision into immediacy. Brielle stood up and came to stand beside the bed. She did not say anything. She just rested her hand on his arm, steadying it. Her fingers were warm. His were still cold from blood loss. Corwin felt the weight of everyone's attention focused on the pen in his hand and the line that remained unsigned. He looked at Lenora, then at Brielle, then at the form that would legally define what the morning and afternoon had already made inevitable. The pen tip touched the paper. The pen touched the paper but did not move, held in suspension above the signature line by a hand that had forgotten how to commit to irreversible actions. And in that moment of hesitation, Corwin understood that whatever he decided would be incomplete because the question itself was incomplete. Signing would acknowledge biology but not relationship, legal status but not emotional reality, connection but not resolution of the morning that had brought them here. Not signing would preserve autonomy but abandon the child upstairs to a truncated medical history and his own daughter to a simplified version of family that omitted half-siblings and sealed records, and the messy truth that people were connected in ways they did not choose and could not undo. The social worker's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it with visible impatience, then told them in a voice that had lost its professional softness that decisions needed to be made within the next 10 minutes, or the paperwork would have to be reprocessed through different channels tomorrow. Corwin set the pen down without signing, not as refusal but as postponement, and asked if he could see the child first. If he could look at the person his blood had saved before deciding whether to legally acknowledge that person as family. Patterson frowned and said that was not standard protocol, but Lenora spoke before she could finish, saying she would authorize it. That Corwin had earned the right to see what his donation had accomplished even if he decided afterward that biology created no further obligation. They moved through corridors that had become familiar through repetition. Corwin still unsteady enough that a nurse insisted on the wheelchair despite his protests. Brielle walking beside him with her hand resting on the armrest in a gesture that was half comfort and half anchor. Lenora walked ahead with Patterson, speaking in low tones about medical updates and visiting protocols, and Corwin watched the back of her head and tried to reconcile the woman who had dismissed him in Martinez with the woman who was now facilitating access to the daughter she had raised alone for 7 years. The distance between those two versions felt impossible to measure and impossible to ignore. The pediatric ICU was quieter than he had expected, insulated against the ordinary noise of hospitals by double doors and careful acoustics, and the nurse who checked them in spoke in whispers that suggested volume itself might disturb fragile recoveries. They stopped at a window reinforced with wire mesh, looking into a room where a small figure lay beneath blankets that made her seem even smaller, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed in rhythms that Corwin had learned to interpret that afternoon as reassurance. Isla, 7 years old, born in March 1994. Connected to him by a mother they had both lost in different ways, and by blood that had traveled from his body to hers through medical necessity that cared nothing for morning dismissals or sealed records. She was awake, or partially awake, her eyes open but unfocused in the way that suggested pain medication was still doing most of the work. A nurse was adjusting something on one of the monitors, speaking to the child in tones too low to hear through the glass, and Isla nodded without apparent comprehension. Lenora pressed her hand against the window, and Corwin saw her shoulders shake once before she steadied herself, rebuilding the composure that kept threatening to collapse entirely. She said something that might have been thank you or might have been something else, her voice too quiet to parse clearly, and Corwin realized she was not speaking to him at all, but to her daughter, through glass that could not transmit the words. Subscribe, before you discover that some choices never finish being made. Brielle asked in a whisper if that was the girl who got the blood, and when Corwin confirmed, she studied Isla with the serious attention of someone trying to understand why this particular stranger mattered enough to keep her father in a hospital for an entire afternoon. He wondered what she saw, whether she recognized anything in Isla's features that connected to their shared genetic history, or whether the glass and distance and medical equipment made recognition impossible. He wondered what Isla would see if she were conscious enough to look back. Whether she would understand that the man in the wheelchair outside her room had given pieces of himself to keep her breathing. Patterson asked again about the form, and Corwin said he needed more time, which was true in a way that made time itself feel inadequate. More time would not clarify whether biology created family or whether family required something that exceeded mere DNA. More time would not erase the mourning or transform dismissal into connection. More time would not tell him what his mother would have wanted or what signing would mean for Brielle's understanding of who they were to each other and to people whose names appeared in records they had never been allowed to see. Lenora turned from the window and looked at him directly for what felt like the first time since the genetic counselor had detonated their afternoon, and her expression held something that was neither gratitude nor apology, but something closer to recognition that they were both caught in circumstances that exceeded their capacity to manage cleanly. She said his name carefully, testing it the way she had tested her daughter's name earlier, and asked if he needed anything before they returned to the paperwork that was waiting in a room 3 floors below. He thought about what he needed, about insulin costs and truck payments, and the specific exhaustion that came from giving too much blood while trying to figure out how much more he was expected to give. He asked for water, and in the asking he understood that he was buying time he could not afford, and postponing decisions that would not improve with postponement. But the asking itself felt like the only honest response available to a question that had too many right answers and too many wrong ones, and no way to know which was which, until years from now when the consequences had finished accumulating. The glass reflected all of them back, overlapping in ways that made separation impossible, and through the reflection he could see Isla breathing steadily, kept alive by blood that connected them whether or not paperwork ever acknowledged the connection, whether or not he signed the form that waited unsigned in a room where social workers grew impatient, and the future remained undecided, and the weight of coincidence felt more like design than anyone wanted to admit.